Scotty Savage is our first speaker. His full bio is online in in the WYSAW materials, but here's a little bit of a bio. Scotty is the director of the Sawtooth Avalanche Center over in the Sun Valley, the Wood River Valley, which he's been doing for a number of years now. Before that, he was a patroller at Big Sky, snow safety at Big Sky. He pays attention. He pays attention to what's going on around him, and he's a really good communicator, although he would never tell you that. He's also the president of the American Avalanche Association A3 Board of Trustees, and as such is somewhat my boss. Scotty's going to talk about the effects of wildfire on avalanche terrain. Scotty, we got a little box here for you to stand on. So, welcome, Scotty.
Look at that, man! I just grew 2 inches. I thought I was done growing. Should be shrinking now. Well, thanks, Lynn, for the kind introduction, and thanks a lot to Liz and Maddie and all the organizers for inviting me out here to share some, what I think, some interesting work. And thanks to you for not being outside on probably the last beautiful fall day, it looks like. So yeah, we'll get right into it here. So this chart right here is looking at wildfire activity in the U.S., and you see a pretty clear trend line right there, going from the bottom left to the upper right, so increasing amounts of acreage, and that's the last 35, 40 years. And it's probably no shock to any of you here because it's smoky, and it seems like it's getting smokier in the summer. So if we zoom out, though, to a longer time frame, so there's the last 35 or 40 years, that clear trend. And the chart on the right, the far right-hand side of that is that little uptrend. Look what's going on in the 1920s, 30s, 40s over here. So while, yeah, it's smoky in the recent history and there are a lot of fires burning, but there's a chance that it could be worse. So I think this is a really poignant topic in that, we're probably not going to see wildfires magically stop burning such large chunks of terrain. So if we, hopefully, is everyone familiar with the avalanche triangle? It's a basic framework that we can use to look at avalanches, where you have the 3 sides of the triangle: snowpack, terrain, and weather. And taking a look at previous research that's been done on the impacts of wildfire on avalanche terrain or avalanche activity. So on the snowpack side of things, there's a fair amount of work. It's mostly hydrologists who are looking at the energy balance and the reflectivity at the snow surface, and mainly looking at water storage and how does this affect snow melt and water storage in our snowpack. As far as weather, there's a little bit of work that's been done on the effects of deforestation, or losing all the limbs off of trees, and how the wind then deposits snow and moves snow around. So there is a little bit of formal work on that. But if we focus on the terrain side of things, which is the topic of this talk, here's what we're looking at for the previous body of research in a nutshell. And there's nothing on there for a reason. There is nothing. So it's pretty much a blank slate. It's not to say that no one's been thinking about it. There have been some informal things that have been published, but as far as peer-reviewed scientific studies, nothing, or just taking a hard look and trying to look at a quantitative analysis of this. It's pretty much a blank slate, which is pretty cool to be able to start looking into that. So again, not to say that no one's been thinking about it or looking at it. Over, like Lynn said, I'm from over in south central Idaho. And as you know, Idaho is famous for potatoes and probably wildfires, because you get a lot of the smoke from Idaho fires. So outside of Ketchum, this is back in 2007, the Castle Rock fire burned up right to the edge of town, west and northwest of Ketchum itself. Almost burned the ski area, but didn't. So it really torched the Warm Springs Creek drainage, which is immediately west of town, for those of you that have been out there. And we've been able to see some interesting things since then, just over the years. So this is a wet avalanche. Right now, I think the guy filming the video, who was really nice to share it with us, he's probably starting to get a little nervous. And he's going to get a little more nervous here in a second. Hear him making some funny noises, kind of gulping. And it took about, this is 12 years after the fire, so it took some time until we really started seeing significant avalanche activity in there. There was a little bit initially, but things really didn't get rolling until about 5 or 10 years after the fire. There are a bunch of structures down there that were in what was avalanche-proof terrain when there was dense live forest above it, that then became threatened, and a couple structures have been destroyed over there in the Warm Springs drainage. There's a road that goes way out there. You can actually go all the way over to Fairfield over Dollarhide Summit, and there are some residences up scattered throughout the drainage. This one was a really fortunate incident where this resident was driving, ran into a small debris pile and became stuck, then walked back home, and then his Escalade subsequently got buried, and they've already removed a lot of the snow above it with an excavator at this point, but it was there for like 3 days. It's kind of funny too, when he got home, he started calling the ski patrol, said someone needs to get a helicopter to get me out of here because I need to be at a meeting in town and catch him. But he ended up being landlocked there for a while. We've had a couple cars, hit, and then a couple pushed into the creek, and all this is coming out of terrain that was burned and previously wasn't avalanche terrain. Another example from last year.
There you go.
Excuse the language here, but this is a great video.
You're shitting me, man. Yeah. This is not good, man. Go. Keep running. Keep running. Fuck, that's for an experience. There was no shopping.
There were no groceries harmed in the filming of this, though.
What the fuck? Excuse my French.
So kind of ironically, these guys were caretakers of the guy whose Escalade got buried. And they also got stuck. This road, they issue soft closures. Basically, they quit plowing it and put up a little closed sign that then people just move out of the way and continue driving up and down the road. There are also a couple really popular hot springs up there that both of those are, well, one is directly threatened by avalanches in a burned area above it. So we do see a lot of impacts, but we haven't formalized any of the studies. These things happen, I think, and so avalanches in burned areas in a variety of communities and locations across the West, but it's become a more widely recognized thing in the last couple of years with a few ski areas that have had big inbounds burns, and it's totally changed how they operate. So then this last summer, the Ross Fork fire, and this is just west of Galena Summit, or Galena Pass, for those of you that are familiar with the area, right outside of Smiley Creek. This picture is taken from just south of Stanley a little bit, looking at the fire when it blew up. When this happened, I talked to Eric Peich, a colleague and friend who works for the USGS as an avalanche-focused climate scientist for the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. And we've been talking for years about we got to start looking at burned areas and avalanche activity. And we came up with some more great ideas on what we were going to do this winter, and then both got busy and did none of it. And then this spring, we circled back to it and got together a group of folks. So Zach Miller, who's in the audience today, he works with Eric at the USGS, and John Sykes, he's a PhD student at Simon Fraser University and a forecaster at the Chugach National Forest Avalanche Information Center up in Alaska. They did a lot of the heavy technical lifting, and especially John did a lot of the modeling work. And don't worry, I won't get into the modeling too much, but got to recognize them because this work would not have happened without them. And then Eric and I, our roles more to ask questions and provide observations. And Megan Ginn's a master's student at Portland State University, and she works studies more on the hydrology side, so those energy balance questions. So the study area, that's the area in the red is where the fire burned. And the Sawtooth Mountains start right here. So that's Sawtooth going that way. Ketchum will be down here. And the town of Smiley Creek's there. Galena Pass will be right over there. And it's one of the more heavily used motorized areas in our forecast area where this fire burned. So some pretty dramatic implications for recreation. So this is in Boise. And it holds true for Idaho for sure. I'm going to go out on a limb and think that it's probably similar here in Wyoming. I'm going to try to minimize the numbers and technical details that we provide here, but figure you had enough caffeine to handle one slide that's a little complex. So don't read the text at the bottom. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the approach that we took for this project. So DEMs, so that's a digital elevation map. That you get a slope angle information from that. So that's the DEMs is what creates the nice pretty colors if you're looking on Gaia, CalTopo, Onyx. So that's where that information comes from. So we took that, and then we need to also know what's going on with the forest cover. And we're able to look at that via satellite imagery pre and post fire. So you can look at the change in canopy and the change in the density of stems of trees that are in that area. So once you take those two, you feed them into a model. This is where especially John Sykes, but Zach and John come in. A PRA model. That's going to basically look at, given the slope angle and the amount of tree cover, identify possible release areas or starting zones for avalanches. And then you take that, the possible starting zones, you feed that into a different model. It's called FlowPy, but you definitely, hopefully you forget that as soon as you leave here. So that model just basically takes, it's any kind of a mass that you have that's moving downhill, it's going to predict what that mass does as it moves downhill and where it ends up. So we can look at where the debris from these avalanches, from these PRAs or possible release areas, where it's going to end up. And then you can also look at something that Havard Toft, a Norwegian, and John Sykes have been doing a lot of work on, an automated version of the avalanche terrain exposure scale, which is Auto 8s. And that gives you an idea of how much overhead hazard, and it can rate it as no hazard, minimal, moderate, and high. So a few different modeling approaches, and then what we want to do is I'll show some results from that and comparing that to what we saw in year one post-fire. So this is looking at the forest cover differences on the left, and basically all the red areas are where we lost either 100% of the tree canopy or close to it. The yellow basically means no change. So you can see some pretty dramatic spots where it burned really hot and effectively lost the entire tree canopy. That aligns pretty well with the burn severity map, so that's a Forest Service product, basically that measures the heat while the fire is burning. So we lost a lot of tree cover, which is to be expected in a fire. So then this is that one of the two things that gets fed into the models. So this is that potential release area, the first model we'll look at. So on the right-hand side over here, all the colors that you see are an increase in areas where avalanches can release, so where they would originate, so starting zones or possible release areas. So it's not a huge difference, but it's still pretty significant in spots. 3.6 square kilometers within that fire perimeter. So we have a lot of different starting zones that didn't exist previously. And on the left, another interesting thing, so the blue is the pre-fire. So on this axis is basically how many potential release areas or starting zones you have, and here is effectively the likelihood or probability of it being. So this would be, very likely to produce avalanches. This would be unlikely. And this blue spike here, so you have a fair amount of unlikely avalanche starting zones. That area basically was shifted over here. They became much more likely going forward. Make sense? So where are these? Where are these changes in possible release areas? Pretty simple graph, but the yellow area are potential release areas or starting zones that were already pre-existing and got bigger. And then the blue here is new starting zones or new possible release areas that didn't exist pre-fire. So we saw a mix there, and if we look at those, about a third of them, roughly, were new. They tended to be smaller, the starting zones that didn't exist pre-fire. And this is an example from Warm Springs, where you can see the crown up there. It was all, dense live trees pre-fire, and then eventually over time, now it's a pretty obvious avalanche path that's being created. So about a third of them were that. They tended to be small, not huge new avalanche paths. And then in about 2/3 of those cases of the increase in starting zones were expanding, so either widening or lengthening just expanding existing starting zones. And this is from last year in Beaver Creek. So you have what was a nice, relatively small starting zone somewhere up in here, or potential release area, because you figure this used to be, dense tree cover. And you can see the old track from the avalanche. It was a pretty narrow, relatively small. And then this is burned mature timber that got wiped out. Same thing over here by much larger avalanches. So hard to say where, but potentially that release area was expanded to something like that. And that was about 2/3 of the cases were similar to this, where you had existing starting zones that were then grew in size, which also creates much larger avalanches and potentially more frequent avalanches by having the bigger starting zone. So this video, this is one of the larger paths up in that drainage. It's probably 1/3 of a mile across at the bottom. And the starting zone up above, it's a ways up there, 2,500 vertical feet, I think. It's probably about a mile wide, and it used to be a real pocketed series of starting zones that would, probably rarely, if ever, go together. But a lot of those tree islands that separated them burned. So in this particular year, we didn't see a lot of these real large design avalanches, D4s. We saw really widespread avalanche activity, but it tended to be, on the medium size. This is one of the few that expanded that historic runout area, and just because this blew through across the drainage and actually uphill where it took out all those trees. So yeah, it was interesting from that standpoint that we really didn't see much huge activity, but I think it's still, this whole year was a good, it was probably representative of a year with frequent but not huge avalanche activity. So this is kind of a good segue into looking at runout zones. So the next model is that gravitational mass flow model that determines where does the snow end up from those starting zones. So if we look at pre and post fire, and this is a lot bigger change where the dark areas was no avalanche potential for runouts in anything that's black. And you can see over here a lot of the black disappears and becomes colored. We'll highlight an area in a minute, area of interest. But we saw a 17% increase in the avalanche runout area. That's within the entire fire perimeter. So this area here, if we look at the bar charts, the blue means no hazard. So this chunk of blue that was, basically safe before, predicted by the models to be safe, gets thrown into a potential runout area. So 17%, so when you're looking at the entire fire perimeter, is a large area that was effectively safe terrain, predicted to be safe, and now is not, that would be impacted by avalanches. And then if we zoom in on the Beaver Creek drainage, so there's a road that goes up this, really popular snowmobile access, and look what happened to it, where you went from basically being safe, not having to worry about avalanches while you're on that road for the first 5 miles going up it, to now you're in the bowling alley where you can be hit by avalanches from either side of the drainage. So some really big implications there. And the increase in area that was affected by avalanches in this area, it comes from not new starting zones for the most part, but going back to those potential release areas from existing starting zones being lengthened or widened. So as you look uphill from these, you'll see that it's an existing path. That had been an avalanche path previously, but stopped basically where the slope angle really decreases. And instead, now you have more snow coming from up above that then blows out, way further, runs through the flats and takes out these burned trees. And Well, probably if it's similar to Warm Springs, we'll see this continue to get worse in the future because you lose that friction that the standing dead creates. So once you take them all out, all those trees, the next similar sized avalanche is going to go even further. So then looking at overhead hazard, again, a slightly different way of looking at things. This is the auto 8s. So the overhead hazard increased by 17%, and interestingly, so the 10% became 15, and this 4% became 6. So it's a 50% increase in areas with high or moderate overhead hazard, which is a big deal if you're a recreator. You know, your safe islands and safe zones, they're a lot fewer down there in the valley floors. So just really broad implications for how you travel down on the valley floors where you think you're going to be safe, where you might have no idea you're in avalanche terrain, but now you are. So what? Why does that matter for recreationists? That's kind of a whirlwind tour through the modeling approach. Well, number one, historical knowledge, so places where you've been going for maybe 10 or 20 years and then they burn, your historical knowledge is probably a disadvantage because it's an entirely new environment. And those old safe zones that you're used to hiding under, you're used to knowing where you can stop and eat lunch, they may not be safe anymore. So I'd really encourage everyone to adopt a much more conservative mindset where you're planning how you're going to travel, where you're planning to go, where you're going to stop and eat lunch, where you need to look up overhead and figure out what's going on. It's basically a new ball game. So treat it like you've never been there when you're traveling in burned areas. And then it's definitely not a static environment. We've seen these burned areas, they behave differently month to month, year to year for decades after a fire. So as you're kind of developing that familiarity with the terrain and these places where you like to go sled or ski, just because you don't see something happen in year one doesn't mean it's not going to happen going forward. So you really need to play the long game with this, that expect things to keep changing as the root structure of the trees changes. Maybe you didn't get the right weather and snowpack to have avalanches in these newly burned starting zones that didn't exist before. So, things are going to change. And then, so a question here, who has sledded or skied in burned areas? Nice. It's awesome, right? It's exciting. You open up this awesome new terrain. It's beautiful. I mean, just on a sunny day and, fresh powder, if you're carving turns on your sled or on skis in these burned areas, it is a blast. So if you haven't done it, you should. But that euphoric feeling, it triggers this brain chemistry cocktail that's going on that's more akin to drugs or sex, if you look at the research. And we're not wired to make decisions when we're in a hot state like that. There was a Norwegian psychologist at the ISSW last week. It was a really interesting analogy he had. It's like, so how clearly are you going to think when your pants are down around your ankles or your knees? And you're not. It's just really difficult to make good decisions in the heat of the moment when we can't fight brain chemistry like that. So try to build that little bit of extra conservative plan as you're going into these new areas, and just recognize that you're probably going to be more prone to rationalizing or justifying doing things that may not make sense when you look back at it when you're in these areas. And we just scratched the surface with this study. There's a ton more work to do. Really hope that it becomes a hot research topic, because I think it's something that we're going to be stuck with for the coming decades. So any prospective master's or PhD students in the crowd who are interested in this, come find Zach or I afterwards or email us, and we'd love to talk. So with that, since I do work for the Forest Service, just had to point out that if you're going to be in a big slide in a burned area, the safest place to be is in the Forest Service crapper. There was a campground surrounding this. This isn't in the study area, but it's just north of that in a different spot. But took out the campground, but the crapper took a licking and kept on ticking. Then this QR code is for the paper that we just recently published, so if you're interested in some more details on it, you can take a photo of that and download it and read about it.
Scotty does have a way with words, doesn't he?
I love when Lynn giggles, you know, that things are going well.
Well, yeah. Who's got questions? Frank has a question.
I've got one.
Hang on. We've got this groovy thing. It's the speaker box. Can you talk into the speaker box?
Oh, I thought I had to put money into it in case I cussed.
That too, Frank. I need to get home.
No, put the money here.
Money goes in there.
So, whoa, this is weird. Well, can you tell us a little bit about what avalanche problems specifically we could expect to be different in those sort of burned areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So which avalanche problems, what's the character of these newer or larger instabilities? So you can expect to see larger avalanches and avalanches in places that used to produce avalanches, they're bigger and they're going to be more widespread, so more terrain covered. As far as which problems, in the Warm Springs drainage, where we have the most history, we see a lot more wet activity, and that's generally north and northwest facing. So not necessarily intuitive that you'd see wet avalanches there. We do see some wind slabs that will start up high, like the guys running with their groceries. Those were probably, just a little bit of wind sifting in the burned areas that were not susceptible to wind loading in the past. But the bulk of the activity has been wet, March and April, wet loose and wet slab. In Beaver Creek, it's hard to say. A lot of those were dry, the activity from this year. But I think it's, using Warm Springs as a proxy is dangerous because it's just one drainage, one fire, one set of terrain parameters. So the easy answer right now is we've seen both dry and wet. So I think anything's expect the unexpected. Anything could happen, but a lot of work needs to be done on that to be able to answer it definitively. Good question.
I got one. See if I can catch it.
See if I can throw it.
We did it. I'm curious, we were chatting a bit about this last night, but I would love, Scott, to hear your thoughts on just public messaging around this. Because you did mention a few times, like, a lot of the roads that people feel really comfortable on or the safe spots that people are really used to have changed. And so are you incorporating that into, like, your daily bulletin? Or, like, what is the strategy to just remind people that it's a new landscape?
Yeah, it's hard. The more experience that we have is with the Warm Springs drainage. And there's a really popular side country area just outside the boundary at Baldy that's called the Burn. It's what it's commonly referred to. And we specifically target that because I think there were maybe one or two close calls with people in avalanches previous to 2012. And since then, there have probably been 10 that are, either burials, double burials, or life-changing injuries. We haven't had anyone killed out there yet. So we do message that specifically. We'll highlight, including the area right outside the ski area boundary at Baldy. As far as areas like this and talking about overhead hazard, we haven't called it out in particular. I think what we'll probably take now that we have something to present is trying to flood the local areas with talks on this as an example. And it's specifically to sledders much more than skiers because you can cover so much ground on these roads that are really popular access points and you're used to it being safe. So everyone's like, oh yeah, no, it's a really scary day, so we'll just go up Beaver Creek and stay down low, which isn't a good option anymore. So we don't really necessarily have a specific plan, and we try to not call out individual terrain chunks, pieces of terrain as a general rule, just because then we're leery that people would read that as, oh, well, they didn't talk about 4th of July, so it must be safe there in another burned area that's exactly the same. So yeah, it's a tough one to address directly. I think in the forecast product, it's going to be more an education initiative and just outreach and PR. Yeah. Good question.
Time for one more question. Oh, I see one question over here. Oh, hang on, hang on.
Yeah, so good question. So is this increase in activity more a function of the canopy being gone and that causing changes in the snowpack? That's effectively the question. So a lot more work needs to be done. This study and a lot of our observations are looking more at avalanche activity, and there's a lot that goes into that. There are some pretty profound changes in the snowpack, but all the previous work has been more focused on hydrology and not necessarily looking at what it does to changing slab and weak layer properties. So I think that's to a certain extent an open book. We could postulate and guess, but obviously there's going to be a big effect with wind, where places that previously could not be wind loaded and now can be due to the change. In the Warm Springs drainage, yeah, we see it's most of the big events have been wet. They'll usually start out as little wet loose dribbles and then turn into wet slabs. And that's been, several years. It's pretty consistent. And not middle of winter. They tend to be March and April. Yeah, in the midwinter in the Warm Springs drainage, no. A lot of those we don't see as much, but we do see a lot of persistent slabs in those areas where, previously there was no, you might have seen loose snow avalanches. So we do see a significant increase in persistent slabs, but the biggest ones so far, and that we're looking just a little, again, I want to stress that, 15 years in one little drainage. It's been, the big slides have been wet ones. But yeah, we do see an increase in dry too, in wind slabs and wind and persistent slabs. Awesome, thanks.